President Jacob Zuma's free education announcement last month was welcomed by many, but also took some by surprise. In a statement just ahead of the National Elective Conference, Zuma announced that government will subsidize free higher education for poor and working-class students. At the time, it was reported by some that President Zuma's free education plan was influenced by Morris Masutha. Now, Morris Masutha actually joins us this evening. He is the director of the Center for Emerging Researchers. Mr. Masutha, welcome to ANN7.
Thank you for having me as well.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, firstly, talk to us about your take on this big announcement by the President of the country of free education for the poor and working class.
Well, from the point of view of the Center for Emerging Researchers, we welcome government's pronouncement. It has been long overdue for a number of reasons. One is that the government's commitment to education as an apex priority has swiftly moved from rhetoric to immediate practice, and that must be welcomed. But number two, we are particularly happy with the increase of GDP from 0.68% to 1%, which addresses not just the gross underfunding of the sector as a whole, but ensures that while higher education participation is widened to the poor and the working class, quality of teaching and learning is not compromised. We are also particularly excited that for the first time, the outdated definition of who is poor and working class, which had remained stagnant at 122,000 annual household income for over a decade and a half, has effectively been amended to 350,000 rand.
Yes.
That in itself ensures that free higher education, as is being phased in, it benefits well over 90% of South African households. This is unprecedented, but it also means that when you look at the profile of the student population, wherein children of the bottom 90% South African households constitute a mere 45%, it means that this intervention is transformative in that government's expenditure in higher education will only go up as and when the poor and the working class numbers increase in institutions. You are sitting, for example, at Stellenbosch with 8% of their student population being on NSFAS. That's because the higher education funding, as well as unfairly meritocratic entrance requirements, have been acting as a barrier to block anybody who attempts to get into those institutions. And we think this is a step in the right direction. We're also happy that the student cries have been listened to when they said NSFAS loans are tying us to lifelong debt. Government has effectively converted loans, NSFAS loans for students who are in their second, third, fourth, or fifth year of study, if you are doing medicine, from loans to 100% grant effectively. That is going to free a lot of stress and burden on students who are probably more than willing to leave campuses in order to avoid accumulating debt. So there's a lot that we welcome about the decision, and we are also aware that such a great decision will attract negativity because it destroys a multi-billion rand student loan market, which has been enslaving Africans in particular through mashonisas. And effectively now, you now have poor and working class families who constitute 90% of our population, and you've got the top 10%, amongst whom 95% of the wealth of this country circulate. And that means there's free education, and those who can afford. Loans disappear immediately, and we welcome that.
Now, this report, or rather, at least this announcement by the President, comes after the release of the Hare Commission report.
Yes.
The President had commissioned this report, but you go on to say that this report is a 150 billion scam. They went on to talk about the fact that the state has no capacity at this point to take on free education.
Sure.
Why do you call it a scam?
Well, there are a number of reasons. But first, let's just correct something. Government did not reject the Hare report in its entirety. Government took a number of recommendations and turned them into policy. And I want to just unpack them first before I get to the scam part, which is very much a factual matter. The Commission recommended that the GDP proportional expenditure on higher education in the form of subsidy increase, and government did that. The Commission recommended that all TVET must be free for the poor and the working class. The government did that. The Commission recommended that infrastructure expenditure in TVET colleges, as well as student accommodation, prioritizing historically disadvantaged institutions, must be increased. Government did exactly that. The Commission recommended that online and blended learning must be explored as an alternative to addressing capacity issues of the sector. The government adopted that. I could go on and on and on. what government did not agree with in our interpretation of the president's statement and government's response to the Higher Commission report is a proposed multi-billion rand income contingency loan model, which was borrowed from Britain. And it is that particular income contingency loan model which we refer to as a scam. But I want to start with a preamble here. There's a quote which I think helps us. It says that once a nation parts with the control of its money and credit, it matters not who makes that nation's laws. Until the issuance of currency and credit is restored to government and recognized as its most sacred competence, all talk of sovereignty, of democracy and parliament is futile and idle. This is important because the narrative behind that particular income contingency loan model says the following. Government, you cannot afford to subsidize the poor and the working class, who constitute, by the way, 45% of the student population, despite coming from the bottom 90% of South African households. But somehow, you have the necessary capacity and potential future revenue to underwrite billions in the form of income contingency loans secured via the banks on behalf of every student, undergraduate or postgraduate, enrolled in public or private universities as well as colleges. That is inherently contradictory. How is it possible that government cannot afford to fully subsidize the poor and the working class just in public institutions, but somehow can underwrite billions of rands on behalf of everyone via the banks? That is what we call a scam. We call a scam because of a number of reasons. But those who know what an income contingency loan model is, they will tell you that in Great Britain, it has not just crippled that higher education system, it has also destroyed that economy. 2/3 of British graduates graduate with a debt of at least £50,000, which is around 800,000 rands. And 2/3 of those graduates fail to pay back that particular debt even when given 30 years. So if the British economy cannot produce a job market big enough to absorb graduates to an extent which 2/3 of their graduates are unable to pay back that debt, what is to explain, what gives anybody the logic that this shrinking South African economy can hold that particular billion rand scam? Now, 2 million students is what the commission would have recommended to government. 2 million students times 75,000 full cost of study will get you to about 150 billion rand. Now, government's pronounced announcement is actually costing 12.5 billion rand. So those who are claiming it's an unaffordable route, how on earth is 150 billion rand more affordable for as long as it's via the banks, whereas 12.5 billion rand is not affordable? That is the scam, and we can unpack that over and over again. But I think what is critical for everyone to appreciate here is that the myth behind income contingency loans is a false and contradicting neoliberal thinking that when you go with these income contingency loans, you lessen treasury borrowing and debt. In fact, the opposite is the case, as we've seen with the case of Great Britain, because what happens is that the loans are saying, government, these students, when they graduate and reach an income threshold, they will pay back the banks. If the student drops out, the government must pay the banks. If the student graduates and not get a job, government must pay the banks. If a student graduates and get a job that doesn't pay him enough to pay the banks, again, government will pay the banks. So if you rewind to the interministerial report on NSFAS, you understand that actually 2/3 of students funded by NSFAS between 2000 and 2010 dropped out without a qualification, which means that if the same repeats itself in the next 10 years, government would owe the banks 2/3 of the loans that it underwrote. So if you take an example, 150 billion rand times 5 years, if students are spending at least 5 years in the sector, that's about 750 billion rand. So where on earth would government get that money? Instead, government has opted for what is, in our view, a progressive intervention to say, we will say that the poor and the working class, which is in line with our policy as well as our commitment to higher education, we will subsidize the poor and the working class, and those children of the top 10% families, who, by the way, already are overrepresented in universities, constituting over 55% of the student population, those ones must pay. But to arrest an unjustifiably hiking of fees, we will increase subsidy. That subsidy will ensure that for students who come from families earning between 0 and 600,000 rand, there will be no fee increment. Now, families that earn between 0 and 600,000 rand are well over 95%, which means when UCT and VET claim they want to raise fees with 8%, what they actually mean is that they're increasing fees for children of the top 5% of South Africa's population. But it's an actual something to look into, because that top 5% actually contributes 35% of the student population in South Africa.
Now, Mr. Masutha, you speak authoritatively on this matter, but then reports have also emerged that you were perhaps behind the very plan of free education that the president of the country went on to announce. Your take on that?
That one is Sunday Times says fake news. Mainstream media has become synonymous with fake news in South Africa. But I'm not using the word fake news Trump style. You see, the myth number one from the Sunday Times was that I'm somehow engaged. Obviously, that is false. Number two, the myth number two was that the cost of this plan is 40 billion rand. At the time, it was 14 billion rand. 1-4, not 40. The myth number three is that somehow I'm behind the plan. First and foremost, the ANC in Mangaung resolved that free higher education must be extended to poor and working class families, which means free education is actually a 10-year-old resolution of the ANC. When it was not implemented in Mangaung after Polokwane, the ANC put a date. It says that implement free higher education by 2014.
Yes.
We don't do that. By 2015, fees must fall start.
So, and then beyond this, your relation, but then beyond this, your relation to this whole conversation. Yes, you're passionate as part of your institution. You deal with education.
Correct.
But your relation, where there were reports that you were then introduced and you introduced this plan, did you indeed have some sort of framework that you put or presented to members of the ANC or government?
Absolutely not. Beyond free education being ANC policy and beyond education being an apex priority of government, I went with a team from the Center for Emerging Researchers to the commission when everybody else was invited to come present.
All right.
We presented our views on the 26th of November 2016. Yeah. Now, during that exchange, the judge made comments about our model. I don't even want to call it a model, our suggestions or recommendations. A few weeks later, we were invited to the Interministerial Committee on Higher Education to present our views like many other researchers. During that particular meeting, we suggested that if you phase in free higher education with poor and working class students starting with just first years, it will cost you between 6.5 and 7.5 billion rand. There was a lot of dispute about the authenticity of that figure, because many people were throwing around multi-billion rand costs. When eventually the technical committee of that IMC verified that actually our figure was accurate, they arrived at 7.4 billion rand. That's how we arrived, we formed part of that technical committee. Now that technical committee is made up of bureaucrats of across line departments which are affected by this matter, as well as other researchers. So we were but a mere fly that participated in these discussions like many others. So free education is not my idea. In fact, this is an insult to fees must fall students who have been banned, arrested, thrown in jail, some dropped out, some lost their degrees, fighting for this implementation of this free education policy, to somehow attribute it to someone who was not even in the country when fees must fall started. So that's what I mean by fake news. It's not my idea. It's an ANC policy, and an ANC government has implemented its policies, and I think people must live with that reality.
Now on to the implementation part. It's going to need not only just political will, it needs the institutions of higher learning. I mean, the likes of UNISA have come out saying they're dismayed at this announcement. They feel that they would have loved to be better engaged on this. What's your take on universities now seeming to be on the other end of this free education pronouncement?
Some vice-chancellors seem to be doing spade work for the banks. This is quite disheartening, because I remember very well one vice-chancellor went on TV and says to students, don't come to me for free education, go to Zuma and his government. Yeah? That very vice-chancellor today is on the opposite side of free education, saying President Zuma did not consult me. Let's back up a little bit. Students protest. We can therefore say that this whole process belongs to students, because had students not protested, government would not have moved with the same speed with which it has moved. But a commission was established. All vice-chancellors presented to that commission. That was the consultative process. Yeah? All vice-chancellors presented them. Most of them were in fact against fully subsidized free higher education. Some of them preferred loans. Okay, that was they were also consulted by Professor Mkhize on the absorption of their proposed 8% hiking. So what they are doing now, it's actually embarrassing for the sector, because you hear vice chancellors, for example, I saw one head of a business school at Rhodes University saying that how can government afford free education for 90% of the students? It's not 90% of students. It's free education for 90% of South African households who earn between 0 and 350,000 rand. Their children, because of the underfundedness and the inequality in the sector, constitute a mere 45% of the student population. That's what makes it even cheaper, because most of these students of the poor and the working class are cramped up in historically black, cheap, and under-resourced universities. That's why you would have, for example, 80% of Univen on NSFAS.
So their interpretation is incorrect, because they are now basically assuming that those earning below 350,000 constitute 90% of the population, which they don't.
It's a mistake that can be made by academics. That's why we must question their commitment to academia, some of them. How can they make that mistake? In fact, there are 203,000 spaces available for first years coming in this particular year. If 45% of them are poor and working class, how can the cost of subsidizing those students at a full cost of study of 75,000 rand be 40 billion rand as an example? That's why I'm saying people must get closer to the details. They'll realize that actually this is not just a progressive realization of free higher education as implemented by government, but in fact, it insulates those who can afford, and it allows those who, amongst whom 90% of our wealth circulates, to pay for themselves.
You know, free education is an emotive matter. Many people would agree that we do need it, but it becomes some sort of a nightmare for the technocrats who are always number crunching. Now, we had the EFF come out.
Yes.
Their leader went on to say that come this year, we're now in Jan, we need to see students, or at least those that passed well in matric, whether it be 10 years ago, they need to come to the university's gates. Your take on that position of the EFF?
I don't usually like intra-party politicking or individualizing matters, but the call by the EFF is political grandstanding and a publicity stunt. So here, ignore it. South Africa must ignore that rhetoric. Here are the facts. 600,000 matriculants are writing matric, or they've written matric. There are 203,000 spaces available at universities. The only way you can qualify for free higher education if you fall within the identified category is if you have a firm offer from an institution in the first place.
Fair enough.
Right?
You're talking about procedure. I went on to interrogate their statement because there's something that they released, particularly on that conversation that was now happening on social media, where they went on to say, but when the president announces free education, you had those students who didn't know that announcement was coming. So they wouldn't have made those arrangements and gone on to apply. So if I was a petrol attendant and I heard this announcement, I couldn't have applied last year in June to be able to access this free education. But now that it's come, we need to consider those. So is that perhaps also an argument worth interrogating?
Well, look, let's focus on facts. There is no lack, there isn't in this country an undersupply of applicants. Some institutions with just 5,000 spaces available already have over 100,000 applicants who have applied. And I'm saying that when free higher education is being implemented, any matriculant, whether you matriculated 10 years ago or 20 years ago or last year, provided that you applied to university, you qualify for free higher education, you go in.
So you're saying the criteria is about application. Mr. Makobe, unfortunately, we have run out of time.
No problem.
I wish we can invite you again to continue on this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. More news and updates on the other side.